leveraging open spaces for the whole student, opportunities for inclusion, DIY dangers, and policies that nurture. Hi, my name is Michelle Oh. I'm the education librarian at Northeastern Illinois University.
Hi, I'm Katie Ediger. I am the library department chair at Harry S. Truman College in Chicago.
And I'm Robin Harris, librarian for the Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies, also at Northeastern Illinois University.
And we just want to thank you first for taking time to come to our presentation. We know now more than ever that time is really at a premium, so we so appreciate you being here. We'd also just like to share how we attempted some space projects that meet the needs of our diverse communities. We're going to talk about a couple space projects, 2 family study rooms, a meditation room, and a classroom redesign. And we'll share how we undertook these projects and share from our experiences implementing them, including lessons that we learned from things we might have done differently and things that went well. And to be perfectly frank, we recognize that a discussion about physical spaces right now feels very far from our reality. But in some ways, many of our thoughts are about what will happen when we return. And we hope that we can return to provide more equitable spaces and services. So we're going to spend the next 43 minutes or so in a panel question format. And I'll be the moderator and we'll be asking questions for all of us. So please describe your students and institution. And I'll begin. Who we are, Northeastern Illinois University, or NEIU, as we'll say in this presentation sometimes. NEIU is regarded as one of the most diverse public comprehensive universities in the Midwest and is designated a U.S. Department of Education by the U.S. Department of Education as a Hispanic serving institution. The university has nearly 7,500 students, and across minority groups, 60% of the student body is minorities. And then the average age of our students is 28. So we're a little bit older than the traditional college age student.
And so we have 2 satellite campuses at Northeastern with libraries, and I support the Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies, which is located on the south side of Chicago. We offer graduate and undergrad degrees in urban community studies, as well as some general education courses. And the campus focuses on an African center perspective instead of a traditional Eurocentric worldview. So everything is in one building, and it definitely has a smaller sort of family-friendly feel. And we have more non-traditional students than we do at the main campus.
And who we are at Northeastern, 81% of our students receive financial aid, and there's other specialized supports. We have the Power Closet, which provides business casual clothing or business professional clothing for students who are looking to go on job interviews or need work clothing. We have a FAST fund that's offered through our faculty union. So that is a fund that's through faculty donations that we provide to students who need emergency funding. So the intention is for it to be fast, like if somebody's car breaks down or if they're having trouble with rent. And these things we want to provide so that students don't become at risk of dropping out of school because of those small emergencies or big emergencies. And we also have a student pantry on our campus, which unfortunately is not very unique anymore. So just to give you an idea of what NEIU is like, and I think Katie has at Truman College, you have a lot of these same services, right?
Yes, so we have a clothing closet and we also have a student pantry. There's also sort of flexible grant options as well for students in need. All right, so this is sort of a breakdown of the demographics at Truman. So a little over 40% of our students are Hispanic, around 20% African American, 19% white, 16% Asian, and then 1.5 multiracial, 0.2 American Indian, 0.1 Hawaiian Pacific Islander. So around 80% minority. The enrollment for Truman, we have a large adult education program, and that's GED, as well as English as a second language or foreign language. We have continuing education students, and then we also have semester credit students. Many of our students, the overwhelming majority, so 73% of students attend part-time. Truman is one of the city colleges of Chicago, and there are actually 7 campuses. All of the colleges are accredited separately, so we're all our own separate entities. However, if someone enrolls at Truman, they can take classes at any of the other 6 campuses. So there's a lot of fluidity as far as, you know, who's on campus. We can go to the next slide. Yeah.
All right. So what inspired the creation of your inclusive space project? And if Katie, you could kick us off.
Sure. So my inspiration really came from an article that I read in the Chronicle of Higher Education that described a family study room at Monroe Community College in Rochester, New York. It described a similar situation to what we experienced at Truman, where many families were already bringing kids to the library. So that was something that I experienced as well. And like we had a few different situations where I felt like we could really use dedicated space. So I read the article at sort of a fortuitous time. And I decided that I would contact the librarian who was quoted in the article. And she very kindly agreed to talk with me. And through talking with her, I realized just how easy it might be to convert one of the spaces we already had into a room that would be dedicated to families, and that could be more supportive. So just hearing how they did it, it sort of made it seem like a less daunting task. And so that was how we got started.
As far as the inspiration behind our kid kits at Northeastern, it really came from an observed and demonstrated need. We get a lot of children at the Carruthers Center Library, basically due to work schedules and childcare issues. It's the kind of place where professors are going to encourage you to bring your kids to class if you don't have childcare rather than, stay home. So I actually had 2 graduate student workers who were the primary caregivers to their young grandchildren, and they would often have to come with them to their shift because they didn't have other childcare. So I actually started bringing in some of my own son's toys and books to keep them entertained during some of these longer stretches. And then when I work at the main campus library, we often see caregivers struggling at the printer, running back and forth between the printers, the computers, trying to, check in on their kid. And sometimes we'd see younger kids crawling around on the floor or older kids just kind of glued to an iPad. And Michelle and I are both moms to young kids. And I talked about, we empathize with these patrons and we really hope that there was, something, we've been in that position and we wanted to be able to help. So Michelle had actually weeded some fake fruits and vegetables as pictured on the slide from a curriculum manipulative set that often got offered up to toddlers, to very thankful students for the few minutes that it bought them, that they had to focus on what they needed to get done. So we had seen a tweet from a librarian at the University of Maryland, if you could go to the next slide, about making these kid kits for caregivers in their library. And we talked about it as something that we could maybe potentially do in our library. These librarians from the University of Maryland actually ended up writing an article about it in the American Libraries magazine that came out in March 2020. So it wasn't until we saw this article and after we had completed our own kids kits, which are pictured on the right, that we realized that we had unintentionally, out of all the children's backpacks in the world, we actually ended up picking the same exact ones that they had used. So great minds think alike on that, but that was our inspiration for the kid kits. As far as the family study room, basically also an observed need was the inspiration, just like the kid kits, of seeing caregivers with children struggling in the library. We knew that some academic libraries had family study space. It wasn't a new idea, but it had come up in a staff meeting that a university department had asked for more office space in the library. And we had an empty office on the second floor that they were eyeing, but that didn't seem like a good use of a space to our patrons to have somebody, using that space as their private office. So the inspiration came from basically not wanting to cede some valuable real estate in the library. But I saw the public library picture on the left on Facebook, and I shared it with Michelle. It's something that they had custom built for them by the furniture company then on the right that now offers it commercially. But we saw that and thought it was a great idea and said, is there something, maybe we could do similar, not on such a grand scale, but just, using this office space. So that was the inspiration behind our family room.
So now we're all going to take a moment to talk about our space projects. And Katie will start again. Thank you.
Sure. So to start with, I talked with the administration at Truman just to make sure that this is something that I could do. So when I brought it up, the vice president was actually really enthusiastic. She was previously a faculty member in the child development department, and encouraged me to start planning. And as you can see in this picture, we had what was previously called the AV preview room, which was essentially, I don't want to call it a graveyard for old media items, but that's sort of what it was, right? So lots of VHS and tube TVs, lots of uncomfortable office chairs. And mainly it was just a room with the lights off and the door closed, right? It wasn't a space that students were using. Can you move to the next slide? Yes. So we took that room and turned it into this. And, a big part of this is because, in talking with the VP about the project, she connected me with a faculty member in the child development department, Jen Azama, who turned out to be an invaluable partner to me on this project. She and I worked to get all of the materials that are in the room donated. We also, at Truman, have a child lab school, which is like a preschool daycare. And they had, a storage space that was filled with items that they weren't using. And Jen knew about this because she works with them. And so, we asked them if we could use some of the things. I think the bookshelf in there is from the child lab school, as well as the table. But all of the toys were donated through a Facebook group that we were connected with. And, I actually didn't spend any library budget money setting this up, which was great. Can you move to the next slide? So you can see here, this is the awesome busy board that Jen made. And this was from a table that was being thrown out. And then she stuck a bunch of cool stuff on it. You can see my daughter in there playing on the right-hand side. This brings me to the time when we took these pictures, right? So these pictures were taken in February when we had a soft opening for the room. And we wanted to create, I wanted to take pictures so that we would have something to share on marketing materials. And we were set to officially open in March of 2020. We all know what happened. So we didn't end up opening. And some of the plans that we had, we've had to sort of hold on. So we'd been planning to do, or actually we had a mural contest that I worked with the art department to promote. So students submitted different ideas for a mural for the room that generated a lot of interest and excitement. However, I think that we asked for students to turn in their mural designs by March 15th or something like that. So obviously no mural. And that's something that maybe we can come back to in the future. So obviously, the space is not open. The library is not currently open to students. So once we do come back, the plan is to have the room reservable through LibCal. And that is a Sprint Share product that allows people to make appointments ahead of time. I really wanted to make sure that the room was reservable because I wanted people, the intended audience for the room, caregivers of young children, I wanted them to know for certain that they could use this room when they were planning to, right? So having a reservation system, I think, would allow that. And we will take walk-ups if people are not using the room currently. You can see that there's a computer in here. We had wanted to put in 2 different computers. We only had, the data connection for one. We also had to change the configuration of the room because of electrical outlets and whatnot. So our vision did not end up looking exactly like the reality, but this is where we're at. So
Thanks, Katie.
As far as the kid kits we did at Northeastern, even though Michelle and I had been discussing it for a while, the need for the kits became more apparent when a teacher strike shut down the Chicago Public Schools for 3 weeks in the fall of 2019. And the number of children we had on campus increased greatly as more caregivers had to bring their kids with them just due to childcare issues. And the university actually worked to help students and staff by hosting space and volunteers to supervise some activities for children in our sports facility and our student union. But we said it would have been great to have some of these kits put together for that, so we could have contributed something and said, here's, some things that the kids can keep them entertained with. So we brought it up at a faculty meeting, the idea of having some sort of kits available, at least coloring books and crayons, something like that. But then our administration actually said we could probably put some funds toward it. So we decided to do these more developed backpacks. And one of our library administrative assistants was interested too. So we ended up organizing a Costco buying trip and a trip to the dollar store, where we bought board books, art supplies, and even, hoarded our own or rated our own collections to bring in some things too. So we put the kits together ourselves, but I will say it was helpful to have someone from our administrative staff involved, because it ultimately allowed us to spend more money, because she's more familiar with funding and reimbursement processes. And sometimes, where Michelle and I were like, oh, we shouldn't do it, she's just like, go ahead, do it. We'll put it through, don't worry about it. So we ended up creating these kits for the 3 different libraries, the main campus and the 2 satellite campuses. We have 8 bags in all, some dedicated for ages 0 to 4 with more child-friendly board books and, nothing more crayons and that kind of thing. And then another for ages 5 through 8 that has a more advanced books and colored pencils and that kind of thing. So we were approved for about $700 and only spending about $400 toward it. So that worked out pretty well. As far as the family study room, we had that empty office, as I mentioned, on the 2nd floor, which was accessible, but not on our busy 1st floor. So it seemed like a good location for it. And so Michelle and I floated the idea of a family room at one of our faculty meetings, and our library admin seemed to be on board. So it was a fairly smooth and informal process, and it didn't require a ton of work to convert the office. And it was kind of nice because the library controlled the project. All we had to do was basically ask facilities if they could paint some walls and move out some furniture, and then the rest was up to us. So it basically is a converted office with one bright wall, newly painted. We removed anything sharp or dangerous. There's one publicly networked computer in there. It's got its own door. There's a large window so you can look through and see what's going on in there. We've got a bin with some toys and books, and the idea that maybe you grab a kid's kit on your way in if you knew you're going to be heading to that room. So as far as having the administrative staff on board, that our admin assistant helped us work with facilities, putting in the work orders. That's something she was used to doing anyway, something that the librarians themselves weren't really that used to working with. But if you could go back to the other slide for a second, I was just going to point out the concerns on the image on the right. There was so much concerns about this door that there's additional office space on the other side of, and there's a lot of conversations about the fictional worries of what might happen with this doorknob, and what if we had it locked, but we didn't want to have it locked, and what if someone needed to get in there and whatever. So when we had facilities come in and paint and brought this up to them, within a second, they were like, we'll just drill out the handle. Like, what's the big deal? So, it sort of shows, trust the experts. They know what they're doing, and you don't have to have all these sort of imagined concerns sometimes. Just bring them in and have them take a look at the space, and they can come up with ideas too. Maybe outside the box, maybe just something that's a quick fix. But if you could go to the next slide. The other thing that was kind of funny to us, so our branding at Northeastern is the blue and gold, and most of the accent walls around the campus, a lot of things are painted this color, and we put in the work orders, we had put in for blue or gold and assumed that that's what they would use. But surprise, somehow when we came to check back on it, we have orange, this kind of bright rust color. So we're not quite sure how that happened or why it happened, but at least it's bright and fun. So we're going to go with it. But that was just kind of, we thought of all the colors that would show up, it wouldn't be this orange color, but it's bright. So, flexibility has to be there too. You kind of got to roll with what you get. So with the family study room and these backpacks, we haven't, just kind of like Katie, we haven't really had a chance to totally test this out because it would have been launching in the spring of 2020. But we're hoping it would give students a place to bring their kids when they're working, as if caregivers need something to kind of help while they're doing their work in the library, that they've got a space to be and kids' kits to potentially keep them entertained. So that was our goal.
Thanks, Robin. Okay, and I'm going to talk about, sorry, I'm having a technical moment, everybody. Okay, I'm going to talk about the NEIU Ronald Williams Serenity Room. Basically, there was a period of time where a staff member who managed the stacks, she found some prayer mats up on one of the shelving ranges on the third floor of the library. And she noticed this a little bit, and students were actually storing them there. So she actually cleared out some of those shelves so that they could keep them there as long as they wanted. And we had seen students praying in our stairwells, which are quite large, and one in particular faces east. And in 2018, students started to ask if there was a place where they could pray privately, because there was not such a space on campus yet. And we had a room next to our lactation room that was essentially housing outdated Microsoft Office handbooks from our Center for Teaching and Learning. And we also had old teacher manuals for a middle school math curriculum set. And it was literally lined from floor to ceiling with workbooks. And that's actually how I became involved, because I'm the education librarian. And so we had to figure out where all these materials would go. So we physically cleared this space, but it was led largely by our stacks manager at the time, Amanda, and an administrative assistant who's both thrifty and crafty. And the room is really small, like the size of a personal study room or carrel might be at another institution. And we wanted to avoid having the room get used as a group study space, even though that is something that we need on our campus. But we wanted to make sure that the purpose for this space was preserved. So we cleared out all the furniture. There was a desk, and we brought in, we actually went on a visit to the basement of our student union where we keep the university property control items. So we found a piano bench and pulled it in, separated it from its piano, and brought it into the room. So that's all the furniture that's in there, and everything else was just made by our amazing administrative assistant, Bonnie. So you can see in the picture, she lined the window on the door for privacy. And then the picture on the right has those 3 panels, the triplicate on top. And she created that covering because this room is actually next to the lactation room. So that was also intended for privacy. And then she created that wall hanging with the yarn, just to make it more aesthetically pleasing. And so the room ultimately met an expressed need. And our Center for Diversity and Intercultural Affairs reached out to us to promote the space. We don't have any circ stats available, but we do know that there are students who now have a space that acknowledges their spiritual needs. And previously we had a space that was just essentially a storage closet. And it was a really easy transformation and cost very little besides the yarn and fabric. So this, I think, was an example of how collaborative and organic a project like this can be. And it really took so many different individuals to make it happen. So not just the librarians, it was really led by the staff of our library. So I'm gonna move on and talk about another project. Our classroom update. So I've sort of created a subtitle for this as the tale of an underfunded classroom redesign, or else AKA sort of the DIY dangers part of our presentation. So I'll tell you basically what happened. We had a number of spaces that were underutilized, and I'll show you a map of our library. We're looking at the 3rd floor and the 1st floor, and we sort of played musical classrooms in the summer of 2019. We moved a multimedia learning resource center, which is the MLRC, that wasn't getting a lot of use for its specialized software and hardware, so much as people were using it for its quiet and relatively private location. And that lab was moved down to our 1st floor into an office right behind the reference desk. And then we rebranded that space the Research and Scholarly Publishing Lab. But that space actually previously held 4 cubicles and 2 office spaces for librarians, and only 1 librarian was using the space. So that librarian very graciously agreed to move to another space, and we created these 2 new spaces, or reinvented them. And then on the 3rd floor, as you can see, there's like a little arrow. We moved the library classroom to the larger MLRC room. And it was much more, so the MLRC is closer to the elevator, so it's a little bit more visible. And this space project for us really emphasized how important the optics of space is on our campus and probably all of our campuses. Other departments live in the library, notably our Learning Success Center, which manages tutoring, our Center for Teaching and Learning, which does professional development for faculty, and many of our student success programs, including TRIO, which is a federally funded program. So there's often requests to get unused office space or classroom space that seems underutilized. And for example, there's a university-wide committee on retention and student success that Robin was actually on. And they did their own space audit and noted how great the MLRC would be for a student lounge or an advising space. And obviously, we want to support our student success initiatives, but space is really a challenge in our building and on our campus, and it's particularly hard to control for our instruction program, which is obviously very important to us. So fueled by a need to make better use of the space, we collaborated with a staff member from our Center for Teaching and Learning, a faculty member who had lots of expertise on active learning, and several librarians and these individuals wrote a grant to turn the MLRC into a media lab move it from a media lab to an instruction space that was more conducive to active learning. But unfortunately, the grant wasn't funded, but the library proceeded. And we proceeded with a can-do attitude and a DIY mission, right? So what happened? The classroom was laid out in a way that didn't really reflect the plan from the grant. The grant we had imagined that the space would now create a U shape of seats so that instructors could walk behind all of the students in the room and then create more opportunities for engagement, and then face a projector. So I'm going to move to the next slide so you can see these are not I'm sorry, the pictures can be a little bit underwhelming and it's hard to really get a sense of this space, but you can see Robin is valiantly teaching in our old classroom space. And the other picture is a picture of a reopening of that space with the balloons and our college president and another librarian. But basically the classroom ended up getting laid out in a way that didn't reflect the original plan from the grant. And ultimately, like electrical outlets dictated our space and overrode our pedagogical efforts to reconfigure the space. Technology was an issue. The old projector couldn't be moved to the new room, and we didn't have a good screen for projecting on. So we ended up using a white wall. So the images didn't have a great resolution, and even the light switches didn't coincide, so that we couldn't just dim the lights over the projected images. It kind of darkened half of the classroom altogether. So this brought up university issues like who should pay for a projector, right? On our campus, Media Services run smart classroom technology, but they're underfunded and overworked, and a work order could take a really long time because there's lots of classrooms that needed upgrades. And it also brought up library issues because we have our own library IT staff, and sometimes that keeps us on separate processes for updates to computer images and other things. And all these presented accessibility issues. For example, the speaker wasn't loud enough. Some power cords had to be put down to make everything work, and that presented some safety concerns. Eventually, we invited the director of our Student Disability Services, who walked through the space and gave us some suggestions on how to better configure it to make it more accessible. And he gave us one great tip, for example, to make sure that we had an accessible workstation, but that it wasn't set apart from the other machines or at the very end or the back of the classroom. He said that we should mix it in with the rest of the workstation so that that student would be like any other student in the room. So the first iteration of the new classroom was a victory in some sense, right? We created a more adaptable and visible space, but there were barriers to implementing the upgraded classroom of our dreams or our grant proposals. And those were outside of our control and taught us a lot of lessons. We eventually reconfigured that classroom again and purchased a projector out of the library budget that had a louder speaker and made other accommodations that we were all happy with, or happier with. But it was a real big learning curve. So now we're going to talk about policies and how to deal with them. And Katie's going to talk with us about that.
Sure. So we have here the policy that we currently have for the family study room at Truman. And this was adapted from the rules that Monroe College in Rochester that I mentioned before that they use. So one reason that I wanted to have really clearly spelled out rules and / policies, whatever you want to call it, for the room was, when I talked about this room with librarians, there was a lot of concern about, like how the room would be managed, if people would just be leaving their kids there. And at Truman, several of our librarians are former Chicago public librarians and had dealt with issues related to unattended children. And so they were, understandably concerned. And so one of the things that I did was, make it clear that this is not a room to leave your children, right? Like that's the biggest thing. Like this is a room to study with your children, or, with the, like as a caregiver or a parent, whoever you are, with your children, rather than it being like a place for kids to be by themselves. And so when people sign up using our calendar system or reservation system, they need to read and agree to these policies before they do so. And if they're coming in as a walk-in, they'll be given information about the policies as well. So I think that being like really clear about what this is and is not is important. And it was important to our staff to make that clear too.
As far as Northeastern and the kid kits and family study room, I mean, the whole idea of doing this was to make things more easy and accessible for caregivers who had children with them. So we didn't want to put up a lot of barriers. So as far as the kid kits, we talked it over with Access Services. And besides putting tattle tape in the backpack, so, an alarm would go off if somebody actually tried to remove the entire backpack, we decided it wasn't going to go through the circulation process of checking it in and out. That defeated the purpose of having someone stand in line and having to do that. So we did stamp the kit books with our library name just in case they got mixed in with other things. But we decided we'd keep some kits at the circ desk and some at the reference desk and just let staff know that they were available to be passed out as needed. And maybe do some social media posts to publicize them. So we all agreed that if some stuff disappeared or if art supplies got used up, we would have to replace the items. But that does require some maintenance and review and some funding. So if Michelle or I leave or get moved into a different position, it was kind of a passion project for us. So we're not quite sure who would handle that if that were to happen. And as far as the family room, it still isn't totally clear about who's going to clean up or enforce policies. We definitely are aware that this was a librarian-led effort by librarians who primarily work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and that it could potentially become a paraprofessional problem for people who are working nights and weekends, and we didn't want that to happen either. So, that's something to be aware of, that, you want to make sure there's accountability to go along with your policies to say who's gonna actually end up having to enforce these. So I think we're gonna move to the next section. Questions?
Yeah, so now we're gonna just share questions that we think would be valuable to ask before undertaking your own projects. I'm gonna move this around, y'all. Thanks. So doesn't seem to work very well when it's just me, but okay. So the first question I'll bring up is, who could I collaborate with to make this project better? So for the example of the classroom, if we had worked with the Office of Student Disability Services before making any changes at all, it would have saved us a lot of time and really helped us make a more inclusive space from the get-go. We ended up making a lot of changes over time that we could have addressed on the first round. And as Katie mentioned, with her family study room, she was really lucky to have an early childhood educator who knew about developmentally appropriate activities and toys that could be included, and also how to get those materials for free without using a library budget, right? So, you know, many of our projects, including the family study room at our institution, just were really enriched by the other individuals who brought their insight and their talents and their crafts and and all of it, right? So another question we would pose is, who should I communicate with about the possible changes? And really, I would say everyone possible, or as many people as possible, and repeatedly, right? And this is pretty obvious, I think, but in some of our projects, some of the changes actually led to a little bit of anxiety. And, you know, one example was, you know, when we were moving around the labs, we put some materials down in an acquisition staging area, and there was some confusion whether that space was going to get used for students and become a public space. And that wasn't the case, but it caused anxiety. And I think it was partly just because, you know, people weren't exactly sure what stage of the process we were in and what was going to happen. And, you know, also, especially the classroom, you know, there's many librarians that work in that classroom, and everybody has a different idea and a different instructional style. And when, you know, it was a different classroom essentially from what we had had before, and it wasn't exactly what we had planned. So that created a lot of anxiety as well. And I think that could have been helped by talking more through where we were in the process. And of course, there's no perfect way to communicate. There's always going to be problems. But I think the more, the better, right? Over communicating about change is really an important tool. And then the last question that I would bring up is just, how can I thank those who are helping, right? Sure, it's all of our jobs to do many of the things that we do, but it's really nice to be thanked. So that could just be a verbal thank you card, a bottle of wine or pastries. But I think that goes a long way, and that means a lot to employees. I mean, a lot of people are overworked. We're state employees, and it really helps build relationships. My relationship with the director of disability services was really formed through this process, and it also got me invited onto other campus committees where we were able to think more about how the library could help students through different lenses. And I think Robin is going to share some more questions.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So just like Michelle had said, you know, the communication is key. So, you know, it's not necessarily just about creating these spaces, or once you've created these spaces, now what? You know, there needs to be an education around them to the entire staff, anyone who works in the library, even if you're not promoting your space actively. For example, I had a student come up to the reference desk when I was working and ask about how to get access to the lactation room. So I walked her over to the circulation desk to show her where she could get the key and ask about it. And there happened to be a student worker there. So she asked him about the lactation room, and he turned around and just yelled into access services, like, "What's lactation? What's the lactation room? Is there a key?" You know, kind of thing. And, you know, made me realize that we hadn't really educated necessarily everyone who worked in the library about these spaces, or who they were for and what they were for. So, you know, sensitivity about maybe the term lactation, and also even the language about how we talk about these things. You know, the fact calling it a new mother's room might be problematic, even though perhaps it's more understandable to some people, but there's a reason you might not want to do that. And we even had talked a lot. I mean, I've been trying to, throughout this entire presentation, talk about caregivers versus parents or family, you know, but a lot of our students are caregivers, not necessarily parents to the children that they're with. So we want to have some sensitivity around that as well. So just being aware as you name things and create policies around them, that your language is all inclusive and that you're thinking things through, that something that's understandable, yet there's a sensitivity to it as well. And another problem that's kind of come up for us, or we're sort of torn between, is marketing, to publicize or not publicize. Some of us wanted to put up a big colorful sign in front of our family study room so everyone would know it's there, but others wanted to keep it more on a need to know basis, with the, you know, fear that it might be abused, that space. So as of now, it's kind of, we haven't really tested it out formally, but it's, you know, you would get the key from the desk. we're assuming it's going to be more repeat customers that know about it. And it's kind of more word of mouth, like our Serenity Room, where there's not necessarily a giant, sign and balloons up of what it is. But just again, some of these questions, there needs to be accountability and maintenance around some of these policies. And it's just something to be aware of, and a question you want to kind of ask yourself about how you're going to do that. So I think Katie's gonna talk next about who the policies are for.
Sure. And so this is, I think that this is a good time to discuss policies in general, not just policies for rooms, right? So, one thing to think about is, how are policies developed and why? Like there are some policies that are a result of a problem, or they're, policies that just have been around for a long time that maybe we should ask ourselves why they exist, right? So I think that one example is like no sleeping policies, right? There are some institutions that have, a policy against sleeping, and I think that Truman is one of those, right? But, I've also worked at a relatively expensive private university where students slept in the library all the time, right? So why are we policing some students and not others? And what is the problem with sleeping? Is it, is snoring more of a problem? Should you have a policy about not being disruptive? So I think that these are things that we should, think about critically and evaluate. So there's not, I really do think that policies should be fluid and responsive, and we should be open to changing them. And I'll just say, when I started at Truman, there was a no food and beverage policy, and there were signs of like literally on every surface, like take your snacks out of the library, like no eating, no drinking. And, as I shared at the beginning, 73% of our students are part-time, right? Like they're balancing work and life and all of these things. And I think that it's the library's role to kind of support the whole student. We aren't, if we only view ourselves as providing academic support, then I think that we're losing something, and we aren't supporting our students. So I think that's important to consider. And then I'll just share, like personally, I feel like I became more aware of some of the impact of different policies on rooms when I was a new mom myself. So, when I was pumping at work, I had to figure out like where to pump. And, a lot of people have, a lot of employees have private offices that they can use. I didn't have one at the time. And so I needed to figure out an alternative. The room that we had for new moms, I think it's called the New Moms Room at Truman, wasn't locked, and it didn't have any kind of reservation system. And so for me, it was kind of like it didn't exist, because I needed to pump during a certain time of day and align it with my schedule. Otherwise, the room might as well not exist. So we need to think about like how we can best support the people who are actually using these services when we create policies.
All right. Well, thank you, Katie and Robin, and thank you everybody for coming to listen to this presentation. We so look forward to hearing about your projects and your questions in the live question and answer session. Our contact information is included in the slides, and we just hope you have a wonderful experience at the conference. Thanks.